Thank you for listening to Taking Up Space. We would like to emphasize that taking up space is not a substitute for speaking with a licensed therapist or physician. We hope to encourage discussion around the topics brought up throughout the show. The views and opinions expressed are the speaker's own, as we can only speak from our perspective, and we encourage you as our audience to listen to all of the perspectives shared here with an open mind and heart, and then form your own. The content discussed in this episode may be troublesome for people to hear. Before, during, and after listening to the episode, please make sure to practice some self-care activities, however that looks for you. Some of our favorite methods here at Taking Up Space include journaling, going for a walk, connecting with a loved one, eating a good meal, or just taking a few deep breaths and some time for ourselves. If you find yourself in any distress after this episode, please contact a licensed physician or clinician for further support. On this week's episode, we're talking about a topic that's affected all of us hosts and a lot of our community members: imposter syndrome. I'm sure many of you have heard this phrase, and we're going to dive a little bit deeper into how does imposter syndrome affect, spoiler alert, it's everybody, but how does it affect the BIPOC population disproportionately? We spent our first couple of episodes talking about how we created the center, why the center came about, and who should be going to therapy, what can you get from therapy, how to find the right therapist. So now we thought it might be important to dive into some of the topics that come up in therapy. Reena, did you have anything you wanted to add on to that?
Yeah, I think that this topic is something that we've noticed as a theme that comes up in our sessions a lot. And as we've talked to each other as team members, it is a resounding kind of common link that we all are experiencing. But I also want to name that it relates to why we chose the name of our podcast as well, Taking Up Space, because we noticed that a lot of us really struggle to take up space, and it is really related to the imposter syndrome feelings. So we wanted to dive more into that and really talk about how we can take up that space and what the surrounding structure need to be in order for us to be able to take up space. So with that, maybe I'll hand it over to Rehana if you want to dive into sharing some background information with us about imposter syndrome.
Sure. I found an article by the Harvard Business Review that was written by a man named Kevin Cockley, and he kind of goes into a little bit information about the history of imposter syndrome, where I'll just read an excerpt from the article that says that imposter syndrome or imposter phenomenon was introduced in 1978 by clinical psychologists Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes. And they defined the term as an internal experience, intellectual phoniness. So the study that was done it mostly included white women. So there were 150 very successful white women in the study. And so they kind of assessed their feelings around their academic honors, degrees. They used high standardized test scores. They also found a lot of these women got praise from their colleagues and everything, but yet they still felt like an imposter or a fraud. And so a lot of the research was mainly surrounding women or white women in academics, but it didn't really talk a lot about people of color. And to be honest, most of the studies that were done in the past didn't really include people of color or include the differences in demographics. So it was only in the last few years where imposter syndrome was kind of redefined almost by considering how people of color experience imposter syndrome on a daily basis, not necessarily related to academics, but actually just kind of the way they move throughout their lives. So given the recent research that's been conducted on people of color and their experiences with imposter syndrome, the definition of imposter syndrome or imposter phenomenon has been redefined as the persistent beliefs or actions of intellectual and professional self-doubt among racially minoritized people due to experiences, systems, or principles of racial oppression and inequity. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. That's so important to really own in on like how this impacts racialized community members, because often like when I think of imposter syndrome, I think of the way that it's been painted has been this like internal experience that is like individualized and personal, where it's like this feeling of I'm a failure, I'm a fraud, I'm not good enough, people are going to find out that I'm not good enough. And I get really curious when it comes to this feeling amongst racialized people, because oftentimes it does not necessarily mean that it's a personal experience of like I am not good enough. It's the messages that we receive from the world around us that really shows us, paints a picture of who this world is designed for, and who belongs, who is successful, who has access to good things in life. And when we don't see ourselves represented, or when doors are not open for us where we can actually like thrive and succeed, then that would create an internal experience. So I think I get really interested in separating that, like that experience from the person, that it's not us as like a person, it's this societal issue of how people of color are treated in the world, especially here in the West. So I really like that kind of focuses in on okay, maybe there's like actually like a structural issue happening here.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, there's a lot of environmental and like systemic factors that play into the feeling of imposter syndrome that have just only recently been talked about or recently been discovered in like the academic world, at least. Yeah.
And going off of that, just talking about the systemic factors and how it isn't necessarily an individual problem. When we look at, I think, Rehana, I think we've referenced this article in our in the resources section in our description, but this article does talk about how the importance of language, how we don't want to say imposter syndrome. The author is very specific about that. They say, what is it again, Rehana? Is it
imposter phenomenon?
Right, imposter phenomenon. And I mean, there's so much to do with language and the language that we use and everything like that we'll discuss at a later time, I'm sure. But again, I think that really just emphasizes that this isn't necessarily an individual problem. And I think that also ties into how a therapist might address this in a session with a client. In the sessions, in any conversation that I've had with people around imposter syndrome, I have always been given advice around, okay, what does your environment look like? Okay, yes, you need to have, how do we develop confidence in ourselves, but also what environment are you in? Who are your support systems? Where are you trying to fit in, or where are you feeling most like an imposter, in those situations? And I think it'd be interesting to get a clinician's point of view, so either one of your points of view, on how would you approach telling a client or giving a client resources or advice on imposter syndrome, and how might that be different dependent on the client you have?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I want to maybe frame it from a bit more of a personal lens. I've had a lot of my own experiences with imposter syndrome, and I get really passionate about talking about this with clients because it's been a long-term shame that I think I've carried, feeling like, am I different from people? Like, do I truly belong? Is there something wrong with me? And kind of being in surrounding environments where I did feel the difference. I did feel like, okay, they're saying and experiencing this, but my experience is not the same as that. What does that mean? And how that has been really internalized, at least in my experience, as like, okay, well, Reena, that's something with you. Like, there's something wrong there. And I think that it's been really helpful for me to step outside of that with the help of a good therapist myself, to be able to look at, well, actually, like, is that just a felt sense of, I'm not good enough? Is that just my own feelings, or is that the kind of environments that I've been surrounded by? So I think we've mentioned before that a lot of times, being here in the West, it's a white dominant world. And I know that that is a part of like my kind of history, is having to be in spaces, in particular in the workplace, but in other spaces in my life that that are white dominated, or maybe with people who don't quite fully align with my values, especially here in Alberta. There can be some of those like values or political ideology clashes in some of the spaces that I've had to occupy, with people who have had very different lived experiences than me, and even my own personal journey of like being in friendships where I felt that maybe these are people that I'm like growing up with, or that I've known for a long time, that I've only just recently started to kind of recognize and question, like, okay, who is actually aligned with me? And so that poses a bigger question of looking around ourselves, and really looking at, okay, well, what do I surround myself with? Am I surrounding myself with what I have been taught that I'm supposed to surround myself with? Am I actually like in intentional right community for me? And in my own therapeutic work, I've had to kind of take a look at that, and make some shifts and changes of maybe leaving environments that did not align, or maybe reevaluating, like, okay, are these the right supports for me? And that's really hard work to do, especially when you just want to belong. You just want to be like loved and cared for. You just want to like, be well and thrive in society and in life. And it kind of like falls back into what we talked about, I think, in our first episode, breadcrumbing. We accept these breadcrumbs. We accept this kind of circumstance that we think that we deserve sometimes. I know that was in my case. And so I often will try to really encourage people to kind of like take a bird's eye view, look outside of themselves, and really look at, okay, like, what is happening around me? And it is that having an impact on what's happening internally, because there's a relationship there that we do need to be looking at. And oftentimes, like, our body will tell us when we're in like the wrong spaces. So that's maybe some of like what I try to like encourage some introspection or reflection around in a safe environment in therapy, is really taking a look at, like, is it really a personal problem? Is it really like just internal? Or, does it have a lot more to do to what's happening around us?
Absolutely.
If that makes sense.
That absolutely makes sense. I mean, it resonated with me. I'm sure it's going to resonate with a lot of our listeners. But just to go off of that, it is, when you're talking about looking at your environment and who you're surrounding yourself with, this is one of my favorite quotes, and I know you both have heard me say it a million times, and I'm sorry. But they always say, like, you are a culmination of the 5 people you spend the most amount of time with. So who are you spending time with? Right? When you look at the people around you, one, do they have qualities that you admire, qualities that you yourself want? But also, how are they treating you? If you're spending your time with someone who's always teasing you and saying, oh, well, I'm just teasing you, that's how I show affection, okay, but then they're always bringing you down, is that going to exacerbate that imposter syndrome? If you're spending time with people who genuinely care for you and love you, but their way of showing that is to say, okay, but why don't you do a little bit better? Like, I know you can get 100% on your test. You only got a 95. What did you do wrong? And that message is always out there too. How does that affect it? Right? And I think, and this kind of ties back into that whole love and rage aspect, where so much of this harshness and this criticism, it's very easy, and maybe it does just come from a place of negativity, but I genuinely think there's so much of it as well that comes from this place of love. And that's what's difficult. At least that's what I found has been difficult, because I can sit there and I can look at my tests and I can say, I feel like an imposter because this is like showing me that I'm doing better than I think I actually know, but also I'm still not doing good enough because I could be doing better, right? There's all these mixed feelings with it, but it all just comes at the end of the day, it comes from this place of love where you want the best for yourself, your family wants the best for you, all of those things. But you have to make sure, do the people who want the best for you, are they, one, do they actually want the best for you, right? But also, are they able to show you that in the way that you need? Are they able to fill that for you and give you that love and comfort that you're talking about that all of us need?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's related to these conditions on which we would have maybe been raised or taught to, like, what conditions we are going to need to meet in order to receive approval, encouragement, love, success. And I often think about where did we learn those conditions? Well, we learn them often from our family of origin. And then what influences our family and their measuring stick when it comes to the conditions. Oftentimes it's like the surrounding environment, the world around them. And that has its basis, its roots in colonialism, capitalism, that really drive those forces too. So that's kind of how I view that. Rehana, what do you think about that?
Yeah, that really resonates with like a lot of what I've been reading and like even like some of my own experiences as well, where like there's always this message where it's like we have to work hard, we have to hustle, we have to keep going, and then like, you know, in order to keep up with society, in order to pay bills, in order to be successful. But a lot of that, like when I hear like family members saying that or like yeah, like people that I know, I just like it really reminds me of like this idea that stems from colonialism where it's like, you know, like with my ancestors in the Caribbean who were essentially slaves, like that's kind of the message they were told by the people that colonized them was they had to work harder, they had to hustle, they had to keep going in order to live a life, in order to like be successful in the eyes of the colonizer. And I feel like that message has like just kind of been passed down. And yeah, and it also reminds me of this phenomenon called John Henryism, which is something I recently learned about, but it was actually based on this idea of a man who literally worked himself to death competing with a steam engine. And it's kind of stemmed in that same idea where it's like, oh, if you're, you know, and this was a black man as well. So he was like, he was a slave that worked himself to death competing with a machine which was created to do the work, but yet he was still made to feel like he had to compete with that.
Wow.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. That really resonates. And
Yeah.
I think that even when you say the word machine, I often think of this whole construct of capitalism and the intersection of that with like the racism and white supremacy, how that is all a machine in and of itself. And then we, as racialized people, we end up, you know, kind of facing that machine because we go out there into the world. We have to like, you know, create a life for ourselves and survive. Often those of us who come from immigrant backgrounds, we want to like make our families like proud and kind of make something of ourselves here in this country. And I really think that that creates this this like grind culture that racialized people are especially vulnerable and susceptible to. You know, I've heard from numerous folks, like friends of mine, that like the resounding kind of experience that we have together is that as racialized people, like we feel like we have to work twice as hard to be seen as like half as valuable. Yeah. And that is like so true where I look at even, you know, my resume leading up to where I am now in my career, you know, always having to like get more and more and more experience and feel like I need to really like collect these experiences in order to be seen as the right person, the successful person, the right candidate. Seeing, you know, people around me, white folks, getting like promoted or getting like encouraged in the workplace, and really feeling like I was never like seen and heard, like for what value I can bring like as my authentic self. And I think that's, you know, kind of a form of masking that a lot of people of color end up having to do in the workplace, is just like kind of fit that standard, you know, what kind of mold that has been set for them, which is rooted in that colonialist, capitalist intersection there.
Yeah. Wow, I think you named like so many important things, like especially with imposter syndrome in the workplace. Thanks for sharing your experiences. Like, it's really tough to talk about this stuff because it's
Mm-hmm.
just so real, and it's something that I think, like, even for myself, like, there's so much shame in like admitting like some of these realities because there's this automatic thought of like, am I just complaining? Am I just being a victim? Am I not doing enough? Like, but then the reality is like, no, like there are so many environmental and systemic factors that really put us in this position where, like, exactly what you said, it's like we're seeing people who are white be praised for things that, like, if we were to do the same thing, like we wouldn't get the same recognition.
Mm-hmm.
And even in the article that I talked about before, like they even talked about like how many times and this was a study that was done, but how many times people of color have been interrupted in the workplace by someone who's white in order to create space for the white person to share their ideas, because that's seen as more like, you know, accepted in the workplace or more valuable versus like a person of color sharing the same thing. Like, it's
Mm.
interesting to like to see that there's actually been studies done on this. It's really validating because
Yeah.
then I'm like, okay, it's not just in my head. Like, it's actually something that's real. It's a reality.
Yeah.
And like they even talked about how like being a person of color in the workplace, like a lot of the like responsibility should be placed on like the top upper management to really like take these kind of things seriously, because one of the things that a lot of people say too is like when they look at supervisor roles, most of the people in supervisory roles are white people. So how does a person of color feel starting in a workplace looking at supervisors who don't look like them, who don't understand intersectionality, who don't who might not even try to understand where they're coming from, or who just don't see things through that intersectional lens? How does that create a safe space for the person of color to share these realities, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It really reminds me of how, in order to take up space, the whole point of what we're trying to do, taking up space and like being our authentic selves, um, the only way that we can actually do that is if we are provided space. You know, it's hard to just insert yourself as a person of color who has been pushed to the margins by these societal structures. That is what, you know, the system actively does, is like, you know, kind of pushes us away, like suppresses us, and you know, makes us smaller. And so in order to be able to take up space, there needs to be an environment where there is space to be taken up in, where people can create space for us. And often I think that is what really defines like allyship for me.
Yeah.
Is, you know, when people maybe take a step back and not insert themselves into everything, so they can create like a safer space for folks who don't get represented in the space. And oftentimes I've seen it like really taken up by people with privilege, dominant groups, who don't have to really think twice about, okay, like, am I taking up too much space? Am I allocating enough space for those who haven't taken up space here, those whose ideas voices go unheard, who don't get to share, who don't get to be themselves. Like, how am I being mindful of this space? And I kind of noticed like maybe that is like a defining feature of privilege is it's not what you've experienced, it's what you haven't had to experience. So when you haven't had to experience there not being space for you, there not being that representation for you, then maybe like it takes more work to have to like take a step back and look at, okay, how am I actually holding this space? And what does that mean for the people around me, especially the people who are marginalized?
Yeah, absolutely.
When you're talking about allyship and kind of providing that space, creating that space, or giving up that space, whichever terminology you want to use, it sounds so scary and it sounds like such a big ask, but really it's not. Like, there's so many things that we deem as anti-racist actions or ways to be an ally that are really just be there. Just be there. Just be understanding. Just say, just say, oh, I've got your back. Okay, yeah, you want to bring something up to our manager? You know what? I agree. Like, that's actually been bothering me as well. Yeah, I'll come with you and bring it up. That's it. That's all there is, right? Like, there, obviously, of course, there are much bigger actions that you can take and everything, but when you're looking at your day-to-day, there's so many little ways in which we can all give up space to somebody that has a little less privilege than us in different sectors. And so much of it, I think, really is just rooted in empathy and just comes from look at it from the other person's perspective. Like, maybe that's really scary. It's like when your friend, if your friend is really, really tired and just can't say their coffee order, that's when you're just like, oh, I'll have a latte, she'll have an iced mocha. Done. How long did that take? Like 2 seconds? Did it take anything out of me? Absolutely not. Is my friend probably sitting there going, oh my God, thank you so much for ordering it for me because I just could not say the word latte right now. I'm so exhausted, right? It just comes from those little things, those little actions, and those little ways of giving up space. Make it so there's more space for everyone. Really just benefits all of us as a whole, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's so true. I think it takes a level of being perceptive to other people's needs. So, in your example, like really like picking up on the fact that, okay, your friend is like struggling, and, how can I utilize my privilege, my like lack of struggle to step in and like be that support. And I think that is also something that takes like intention, and relationship communication, right? Because you also don't want to like insert yourself and like, hijack and take over in a way that maybe like overrides or erases the other person, which could happen in that scenario where maybe your friend didn't actually want you to do that for them, right? Yeah. So I think, yeah, there's just a level of, I think, really attuning to other people that comes with that I think maybe perhaps like experiences of privilege can block.
Yeah, I completely agree. And like you said, the communication aspect, right? Like, I have a friend who recently we went shopping and she's just like having one of those days, where your like car keys aren't working, like you're dropping everything. And she's like, oh my gosh. And I was like, don't worry, I got it. Like, I know what you want. I'll just go grab it for you, right? But the reason we could do that was because in the past she's communicated it to me. She said, hey, this is what I look for. And I've also asked her in that moment, I said, is this going to help you? And I think there's so many times that people get worried to do that because they're scared of overstepping, right? They're scared of kind of taking control or they're scared that the ways in which they think they're giving up space is actually taking up more space. And again, coming all back to that whole like rooted in love. But when that happens, you can just ask. You can just ask the person. Very, very rarely will you meet somebody that says, oh my gosh, how dare you ask me how you can help me? Mm-hmm. Who's going to say that? Like, the majority of people aren't, right? So, I mean, if you're listening to this and you're sitting there and you're thinking, I want to give up a little bit of space, or, hey, I wonder how I could support somebody today, you can ask them. It is completely okay to say, how can I support you? Or, if I do X, Y, and Z, will this support you? And I think, when we look back into imposter syndrome and we think about what are the ways in which we feel like an imposter, what are the ways in which, like, what situations are we there that we're thinking, oh my gosh, I'm really feeling the imposter syndrome, like I really don't feel like I belong. Who can we go to in these situations to say, one, am I imposter? Like, does my sentence make sense, right? Like, does this make sense? But also, who can we go to say, hey, do you think, like, do you agree with my perspective on this? Okay, do you mind sharing meeting minutes with me? Okay, can we work together? There's so much communication, and like you said, it comes back to that relationship. But at the end of the day, like, they are very nuanced and can be very delicate. But as long as there's that basic understanding of empathy and love, and just that basic, like, knowing that somebody's probably coming at it from a good place, you can figure it out. And that is why it is so important to have the right people in your circle and in your environment. Because then you can figure it out with those people, and it's okay to make a mistake because it'll be okay.
Yeah, one of the things I've been practicing a lot lately is asking for help, and doing so intentionally, going to people who I feel really have my back. And one of those pieces of having imposter syndrome is this feeling of, okay, well, if I am struggling with something, I can't let anyone know that I'm struggling. Because if they know that I'm struggling, then they're going to think I'm even more of a fraud. They're going to think like really poorly of me. So I need to suffer alone in this, and I need to just like, stomach it, deal with it, meet the standard, work even harder. And I find this, we've kind of put some of this framework into like the workplace, but as people of color, we face imposter syndrome everywhere, daily. I often find, with my friendships, I will struggle a lot to ask for help and say, hey, I'm having a hard day. Can we just like go spend some time together? Can you come over and like help me with some of my housework? Or, can we just like have a little chat? Can I like release some of this off my chest? And it's this feeling of like, if I take up space with my needs, I am going to be a burden. I'm going to be too much. I can't be too much. I need to just, be as small, as little as possible, and not take anything out of anyone else, because, if they have to help me at all, like that is inconveniencing them. And so I think that really kind of goes back to like that idea of like, the taking up space is so scary because it means that we're going to have like a presence when we've been taught that our presence is maybe like not welcome. That there's kind of like a message there, as a racialized person, that like, okay, well, maybe I'm not actually like wanted here, wanted in my fullness. So if I put myself out there in my fullness, that's going to be too much for people. So I may as well just tiptoe around, and not take up any space at all.
It involves a lot of vulnerability.
Yeah.
That's what it is. It's vulnerability. You have to be vulnerable. When you have the people that make you feel safe, make you feel understood, just provide you however it looks for you. But they give you that sense of, if I take up a little space, they're still going to love me. They're not going to see me as a burden. Then it makes it so much easier, right? And then when you're able to kind of take up that space, partly because of your ability, but also the people around you and the situations and environments you're in, then you're able to transfer that into new situations and new environments. And that's how you kind of get that ripple effect, and it grows and it keeps going. And
it reminds me of what we were talking about with Manam in our last episode, that kind of fusion of the like collectivism and the individualism, where actually like being able to lean into taking up space can be so healing for us as people of color who come from maybe perhaps collectivist backgrounds, and also infusing the individualism, because it's like, I have needs, my needs are important, and I can rely on those around me and really like ask for that space from the people around me, and it can honor with love myself as well as those around me too. And it's a give and take. I can take up that space, but I can also share space and invite other people in my space. And that's this concept of community care that I think is so important. And maybe we'll unpack that more in the future, because I think that's what we really try to do at the center, is community care instead of just like this idea of self-care, right? And so that's a part of it, is this taking up space. And I also want to acknowledge that there are going to be barriers to this. Not all of us have been given the chance to like know and learn what healthy relationships are. In fact, a lot of us struggle with that. And so the kind of community that we have around us can be a byproduct of maybe not quite learning yet what is healthy, intentional, right community for us. And that does take time. And I want to throw it out there to our audience that that is not like, a perfect standard. We're sitting here talking about this, but I know, just because I know both of you, I know we've all struggled with that, with like, having healthy relationships. And that is like an ongoing process of honoring ourselves, honoring what we need in relationships. And I, that's been a big area of growth for me, is learning, what spaces do I actually need to be in? And maybe that's what we're trying to like create and achieve with this center, is that like safer space for being with each other in these experiences, when we maybe haven't been given those safer spaces in a lot of places before.
Mm-hmm. I could definitely see how, yeah, like having that community can really help us with our confidence when we do move through the world with being in predominantly white spaces, like just knowing that we have a community, knowing that like even just that piece, Reena, that you mentioned of like opening up, and I know Crystal, you talked about like the vulnerability as well, like just opening up with others, being vulnerable, saying like, hey, like I'm really struggling with this, like is this something you experience too? I think having that validation of knowing that there are others experiencing the same thing can really help with that feeling of isolation that a lot of us feel with imposter syndrome, where it's like it feels like, oh my gosh, like I'm like, me specifically, I'm the only one experiencing this. It could feel very like, yeah, like isolating, and just like makes you kind of feel alone in that. But knowing that there are other people who might be going through the same things, who might also have like a similar background, share like similar experiences, maybe they might have like some like degrees or things like that, where it's like even then they might still be experiencing imposter syndrome. It can be really encouraging to like feel like, okay, like I actually, it's not just me, other people are experiencing this. I have a place where I belong. I have a place where I can talk about this. Yeah, I think it makes a big difference.
It definitely does. We tend to compare ourselves to others as humans. It's kind of like a phenomenon that a lot of us struggle with. And often we kind of look to these standards, maybe on social media, where we're like, oh, it looks like everyone else has their life together, or they have like all these things that they want, they've achieved this and that. I'm so much lesser than. And so I think it really helps to shield us from that comparison trap that we can fall into when we have the right intentional community around us, where we can go and belong and be amongst people who also relate with our experiences. I've mentioned how with starting some of the groups that really launched me into founding this center, that was the space where it was like, oh, okay, so these are not just things that I've thought in my head, that I've experienced. Now I'm running a group with like community members who also experience these things, and we're talking about this and naming this as like a real, tangible, like effect that we've all gone through. And even just like putting out some of the content that we do at the center when we share on social media on a special topic that really relates to people of color, seeing the responses of like, wow, this really resonates with me. I think we've been noticing as folks, doing the work here at the center, that really fuels us as like, whoa, like we're saying and doing things that actually like people really resonate with, they've also experienced. And I think that's like the power of gathering people of color together and naming these things that we usually don't talk about, because it creates that effect of like, okay, I'm not alone. It's not just a me problem. And it kind of combats that personal internalized shame that we go through. And I think it helps us to like step from shame into more compassion, because it states like, you know, okay, I'm a human going through a human experience that is a specific kind of experience that people of my like racial background, or, you know, people who have been marginalized in this way also go through. So it's been hugely helpful, I find, to really take a look at that bigger picture of like, this is so much like bigger than myself. This is outside of myself, so that we don't fall into that isolation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you named a lot of really important things to think about. Yeah, honestly, like we could literally probably talk about this for like 5 or 6 episodes. There's just so many things, so many branches with imposter syndrome where it's like, and layers to this topic that can be really like, yeah, interesting to kind of like, I guess like dive into and explore. Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us on this episode. I hope this resonated with a few of you and you feel a little bit of that sense of belonging and community that we were discussing. Just something to reflect on. I know I'll be reflecting on this, so I wanted to pose this to all of you listening, but what is the space, you know, physical, emotional, a person, whatever it is, where you feel like you belong? And if you don't have that space, that's okay. We have all been there. We've all felt like we haven't belonged at some point or another in our lives. But what does that space look like for you? You know, how can you create that space? Can you create that space? What does that look like? And like we said in the beginning, this episode probably brought up a lot of feelings. So during this reflective exercise, make sure you're taking time for yourself, whatever that looks like for you. If that means watching an episode of your favorite show on Netflix, playing a video game, going for a run. Remember, rest is productivity. So whatever it looks like for you to take a moment, take some rest as you reflect on this, please try and do so. Thanks again for joining. If you are interested in further resources and readings, you can find some articles referenced in the episode description. Thank you for joining us on this week's episode. We would like to thank everyone involved at the BIPOC Healing and Wellness Center, our staff, volunteers, and community members. Special thanks to Caden, Landry, and Jeremy for the behind-the-scenes support. We're extremely grateful for your support, and as always, we hope you take up some space, however that looks for you.